January 29th, 1944, 3 hours before dawn. The air along the Anzio beachhead carries the salt of the Tyrrhenian Sea mixed with cordite and wet earth. In the darkness, a young American ranger crouches in a drainage ditch beside the Via Anziate, his hands wrapped around a metal tube that weighs less than 15 pounds. The weapon is so new that many in his unit have fired it only twice in training. German soldiers, when they first encountered it weeks earlier in North Africa, laughed. They called it the stovepipe, the toy pipe, a length of iron tubing that looked like something a plumber left behind. His name is Private First Class Warren G.H. Zip Eaton, though the records will blur and histories will argue, and some will say it was another man entirely, because war has a way of scattering the names of the brave like ash in the wind. What remains undisputed is this. Somewhere along that blood-soaked road between the beaches and the Alban Hills, one American soldier with a bazooka held a position alone against 9 German Panzers, and when the sun rose, all 9 were burning. The night smells of diesel and fear. In the distance, the low growl of engines, the sound every infantryman has learned to dread, the mechanical breathing of German armor moving through the Italian winter. 6 weeks earlier, the planners in Allied headquarters had looked at maps of the Italian coast and seen opportunity. Operation Shingle, they called it. An amphibious end run around the German Gustav Line. A landing at Anzio to cut supply routes and force Field Marshal Kesselring to abandon his mountain fortresses. On paper, it was elegant. The beaches were lightly defended. The roads to Rome lay open. Churchill himself championed the plan, envisioning a bold stroke that would unhinge the entire Italian campaign and deliver the Eternal City like a gift to the Allied cause. But between the idea and the execution falls the shadow. Between the map and the mud lies the difference between war as imagined and war as endured. The Rangers came ashore on January 22nd under a sky surprisingly empty of enemy aircraft. They pushed inland against scattered resistance, secured the port, and waited for orders to drive north. But Major General John P. Lucas, haunted by the specter of Salerno and Gallipoli, hesitated. Instead of racing for the Alban Hills while the roads were clear, he consolidated. He dug in. He built supply depots and organized traffic control and waited for reinforcements. And while he waited, Kesselring did not. Within 48 hours, German divisions began converging on Anzio from across Italy. Panzer units pulled from rest areas. Paratroopers rushed south from Rome. Infantry detached from quiet sectors. By the time Lucas was ready to advance, the window had closed. The beachhead became a cage. The men called it the boot camp from hell. 23 miles of front line shaped like a kidney pressed against the sea, with 70,000 Allied troops packed into beaches and fields that offered no cover, no high ground, no room to maneuver. And surrounding them, a tightening noose of German steel. For the Rangers, the situation carried particular bitterness. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were the descendants of Rogers Rangers and the inheritors of Darby's legacy. Men trained to strike fast and fade into shadows, to climb cliffs and slit throats and disappear before the enemy knew they'd been hit. They were raiders, not garrison troops. Yet here they sat, pinned on a beachhead, trading artillery shells with an enemy they could not see, waiting for the inevitable counterattack. They did not have to wait long. The German planners called it Fischfang, Operation Fish Catch. The objective was simple. Drive a wedge through the Allied center, split the beachhead in two, and push the invaders back into the sea. For this, Kesselring assembled a hammer worthy of the anvil. 4 divisions, including the 114th Jaeger Division, reinforced with elements of Panzer and Panzer Grenadier units. Tiger tanks, Panthers, the brutally efficient Sturmgeschütz assault guns. Over 450 artillery pieces to soften the defenses before the armor rolled. The German soldiers who prepared for the assault did so with confidence bordering bliss on certainty. Many were veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had broken Soviet lines at Kharkov and Kursk, who had weathered Stalingrad and lived to fight again. They had seen what happened when German armor achieved breakthrough, the rolling collapse, the panic, the rout. They expected the Americans to fold like the French in 1940, like the British at Dunkirk. Green troops, they'd been told. Boys who'd never seen a winter campaign, who thought war was something from the cinema screens back home. And their contempt extended to American equipment. The Wehrmacht prided itself on engineering, on the mathematical precision of the Panthers' sloped armor, on the killing power of the 88mm gun, on tanks that were not merely vehicles but mobile fortresses. When they first encountered the American Bazooka in Tunisia, the reaction was dismissive. The M1A1 rocket launcher, officially, a simple tube, open at both ends, that fired a 2.36-inch rocket with a shaped charge warhead. It weighed 13.5 pounds empty. A single soldier could carry it, load it, fire it. To German tankers trained to fear the Soviet 76mm anti-tank gun or the British 17-pounder, it looked like a toy. The Panzerschreck they would later develop was a direct copy, but heavier, more complex, more German. The original seemed almost insulting in its simplicity. What they failed to understand, what the textbooks and the engineering manuals could not teach, was that in war, elegance matters less than availability. Complexity is a luxury purchased with industrial capacity and time. The bazooka was simple because American doctrine valued putting anti-tank capability in the hands of every infantry platoon, not concentrating it in specialist units. It was light because American soldiers had to carry it across oceans and up mountains and through jungles on 3 continents. It was crude because crude was fast to manufacture and easy to repair. By 1944, American factories were producing 15,000 bazookas a month. Each Ranger battalion landing at Anzio carried dozens. The Germans would learn the cost of their contempt in fire and iron. The attack began on the morning of January 29th with an artillery barrage that turned the sky white. For 2 hours, German guns pounded the Allied positions, walking shells across the forward trenches, collapsing dugouts, shredding communication lines. Then the armor came, emerging from the morning fog like iron ghosts. Panthers and Mark IVs advancing in echelon, their turrets traversing slowly. 75mm guns firing methodically at anything that moved or might be hiding something that could move. Behind them, waves of infantry in field gray, experienced soldiers who moved with the tanks, using the hulls for cover, suppressing Allied positions with machine gun fire while the armor rolled over them. The initial penetration achieved what German planners hoped. A salient driven into the Allied center, carving through positions held by the 45th Infantry Division, threatening to reach the coast. For a few terrible hours, the outcome hung in balance. If the Panzers broke through to the beaches, the entire beachhead would collapse. There would be no Dunkirk-style evacuation under German artillery fire. It would be annihilation. Every available unit was thrown into the breach. Cooks and clerks grabbed rifles. Artillery batteries lowered their guns to fire over open sights at approaching tanks. The Navy offshore turned its destroyer guns inland, dropping 5-inch shells on German assembly areas. And along the Via Anziate, the road that offered the most direct route to the sea, the Rangers dug in. This is where records fracture and legend bleeds into history. The after-action reports are fragmentary. Entire companies were overrun, their positions erased, their stories lost in the chaos. What survives are fragments. Purple Heart citations, Silver Star recommendations, witness statements given weeks later by men whose memories were scarred by trauma and morphine. But from these fragments, a picture emerges. Somewhere along that road, in a ditch or behind a farmhouse wall, or in a crater blown by German artillery, one Ranger found himself alone with his bazooka and a small pile of rockets. His squad was dead or scattered. His lieutenant was silent on the radio, either dead or pinned down elsewhere. And approaching through the smoke and the screaming were German tanks. Not 1 or 2, but a column, advancing in the confidence that no single infantryman could stop them. He could have run. No one would have blamed him. No manual or regulation required a lone soldier to engage a panzer platoon. Retreat, regroup, live to fight another day. These were not just acceptable choices, but tactically sound ones. But he stayed. Perhaps because there was nowhere to run. Perhaps because he understood that if those tanks reached the beach, everyone died anyway. Perhaps because in that moment, the choice was not between survival and death, but between dying for nothing and dying for something that mattered. He loaded the first rocket. The bazooka required 2 men to operate efficiently, a gunner and a loader. Alone, the process was clumsy. Slide the rocket into the rear of the tube. Connect the wire that would complete the electrical firing circuit. Check that the contact spring engaged properly. Tap the gunner's shoulder to signal readiness. Except there was no gunner's shoulder to tap. He was both men now. The lead Panzer was perhaps 100 yards away when he fired. The backblast from the rocket motor threw up a cloud of dust and smoke, marking his position as clearly as a flare. The rocket streaked forward, trailing smoke, covering the distance in less than a second. The shaped charge warhead detonated against the Panzer's glacis plate with a crack like lightning striking steel. The physics of the shaped charge are elegant. The explosive collapses a cone of copper into a jet of superheated metal moving at hypersonic velocity, burning through armor not by force but by concentrated energy, by temperatures that turn steel into vapor. The jet punched through. Inside the tank, men died instantly, burned or shredded by spalling fragments, and the Panzer lurched to a halt, smoke beginning to pour from the hatches. The Germans reacted immediately. The remaining tanks traversed their turrets, seeking the source of the shot. Machine guns raked the area. But the Ranger had already moved, rolling into a new position, loading another rocket. The fog and smoke worked in his favor. The Panzer commanders could not locate him precisely, and they were trained to fear infantry in close terrain, to know that a stopped tank is a dead tank. They kept moving, seeking to push past the resistance point, to maintain momentum. He fired again. Another hit, this time on a Mark IV, the rocket striking the thinner side armor. The tank shuddered, slewed sideways as the driver reflexively turned, and stopped. 2 down. The German infantry accompanying the tanks began to converge on his position, but they were cautious now, unsure how many bazookas were in play, whether this was one man or a prepared anti-tank ambush. Their caution bought him seconds. Precious seconds to move again, to reload, to sight on another target. The 3rd Panzer died to a shot that struck the engine deck, setting the fuel tanks ablaze. The 4th took a rocket through the turret ring, jamming the traverse and forcing the crew to bail out. The 5th and 6th were closer now, and he was running out of positions, running out of cover, firing from spots so exposed that only the smoke and confusion kept him alive. Each shot was a lottery. Each second he remained in place after firing was borrowed time. But the rockets kept flying. The M6A1 rockets, with their simple impact fuses and their conical warheads that looked crude but worked, that penetrated and burned and killed. The German advance faltered. Tank commanders who moments before had been confident now faced an invisible enemy who struck and vanished and struck again. They did not know they were fighting one man. How could they? No single soldier could account for this much destruction. It had to be a platoon, a company, a prepared kill zone. By the time he fired his last rocket, 9 German tanks were burning or disabled along a quarter-mile stretch of road. 9. The number seems impossible, the stuff of propaganda films and war comics. But the reports exist, signed by officers who saw the aftermath, who counted the hulks and interviewed the survivors and could find no other explanation. 1 Ranger, 1 bazooka, 9 tanks. When relief finally reached his position, they found him still alive, still conscious, slumped against the wall of a shattered farmhouse with empty rocket tubes scattered around him like spent shell casings. His hands were burned from the backblast. His uniform was torn and scorched. He was shaking so hard he could not light the cigarette they offered him. He had held the line. Alone. The German counteroffensive at Anzio continued for 3 more days, but the momentum was broken. Where they expected to find a gap, they found Rangers who would not yield. Where they expected American troops to panic under armor assault, they found soldiers who stood in ditches with bazookas and fought Panzers at ranges so close they could see the faces of the tank commanders. The attack ground forward meter by meter, paid for in blood and iron, until finally Kesselring called it off. Fishfang had failed. The Allies remained on the beachhead, but the cost was staggering. The Ranger battalions, those elite units that had scaled the cliffs at Pointe du Hoc and fought their way through North Africa and Sicily, were shattered. The 1st and 3rd Ranger battalions, surrounded in the town of Cisterna during a reconnaissance in force, were destroyed almost to the last man. 761 Rangers went into Cisterna, and only 6 returned. The 4th Rangers, holding positions along the main line, were ground down by artillery and counterattacks until they existed more as a memory than a unit. The German soldiers who survived Anzio carried their own lessons home. They learned that American troops, derided as soft and inexperienced, could fight with a tenacity that matched anything they had encountered in Russia. They learned that American industry, which they had been told was focused on luxury cars and refrigerators, could produce weapons simple and effective enough to arm every infantryman with tank-killing capability. They learned that the bazooka, the toy pipe they had mocked, was deadly in the hands of soldiers willing to stand their ground. But more than tactics and equipment, Anzio taught a deeper truth about the nature of American warfare. The German military tradition prized the heroic individual, the ace pilot, the panzer commander with 100 kills, the stormtrooper who led from the front. These were celebrated, mythologized, held up as examples of Aryan superiority. Yet this heroism was bound to hierarchy, to obedience, to a system that valued excellence within prescribed roles. The American approach was different, more chaotic, harder to quantify. It distributed agency downward, trusted sergeants and privates to make life-and-death decisions, equipped every squad with weapons that in other armies would be restricted to specialists. It was not that Americans valued heroism less, but that they democratized it, made it accessible to every soldier who found himself alone in a ditch with a choice to make. The Ranger with the bazooka was not exceptional because he possessed superhuman skill or training. He was exceptional because the circumstances demanded it and the tools were available. And the culture he came from taught him that one person, in the right place at the right moment, could matter, could change outcomes, could stop 9 tanks. This was the thing the Germans never fully grasped, the variable that did not fit their equations. They understood industrial capacity, American factories outproducing German ones 5-to-1, 10-to-1. They understood logistics, American trucks and ships and supply chains that functioned with mechanical precision. But they struggled to understand the decentralization of initiative, the willingness to put lethal technology in the hands of ordinary soldiers and trust them to use it. The bazooka was a symbol of this philosophy. Cheap, simple, mass-produced, effective. A weapon that said, you do not need to be a hero to fight armor. You only need to be willing. The bazooka itself became legend. From Anzio, it spread across every theater, into the hedgerows of Normandy, into the forests of the Ardennes, into the islands of the Pacific. It was never a perfect weapon. The rocket motor was unreliable in cold weather. The warhead struggled against the frontal armor of Tiger and Panther tanks. Effective range was short, requiring soldiers to engage armored vehicles at close range. Vehicles at distances where machine guns and high-explosive shells turned the air lethal. But it was there, in every platoon, every company. A tool that turned infantrymen into tank killers, that gave soldiers facing overwhelming odds a fighting chance. German engineers studied captured bazookas and produced their own version, the Panzerschreck, heavier and more powerful, but following the same principles. Later, they developed the Panzerfaust, a disposable single-shot weapon that was even simpler. Imitation, as they say, is the sincerest form of flattery, but also admission. Admission that the crude American toy pipe worked. that simplicity and availability mattered more than perfection. Japanese soldiers in the Pacific encountered the bazooka and found it baffling. Their doctrine held no equivalent. Japanese anti-tank tactics relied on close assault, soldiers with magnetic mines or satchel charges rushing bunkers and tanks in suicidal attacks, trading life for destruction. The idea that a soldier could stand 50 meters away and destroy a tank with a weapon he carried on his shoulder, then move and survive to fight again, contradicted their understanding of warfare as a contest of spiritual will. They adapted, eventually, but the adaptation came late and never fully. For the Americans, the bazooka was simply another tool in a vast arsenal, useful but not miraculous. What made it effective was not the weapon itself, but the industrial system that produced it in quantities sufficient to equip every unit, and the training system that taught every soldier how to use it, and the cultural assumption that ordinary men could and would perform extraordinary acts if given the means. The records do not agree on the name of the ranger who stopped 9 tanks. Some sources say Warren Eaton, others reference different individuals, and official army documents are frustratingly vague, casualties and heroics blurred together in reports written by exhausted officers weeks after the fact. Perhaps it does not matter. Perhaps the uncertainty is itself the point, that this act of defiance could have been performed by any of the thousands of young Americans who landed at Anzio with bazookas and grim determination, who stood in ditches and farmhouses and rubble, and fought because retreat was not an option and surrender was unthinkable. What matters is the act itself and what it represented. A single soldier with a simple weapon changing the course of a battle, buying time measured in minutes that translated to survival measured in days. The German offensive broken not by grand strategy or overwhelming force, but by individual soldiers making individual stands in 100 forgotten places along the beachhead perimeter. After the war, veterans would speak of Anzio in hushed tones, if they spoke of it at all. It was not a glorious campaign. There were no triumphant breakthroughs, no bold maneuvers. It was siege and stalemate, artillery duels and small unit actions, men dying in the mud for yards of ground that meant nothing except that holding it meant the Germans did not have it. The breakout would not come until late May, when the spring offensive finally shattered the Gustav Line, and the surviving Rangers, the remnants, the fragments of the original battalions, marched into Rome with the rest of the Fifth Army. But among those veterans, the story of the Lone Ranger with the bazooka circulated like currency. Details changed with each telling. The number of tanks varied, the location shifted. But the core remained constant. One man, one weapon, impossible odds. It became a parable, a reminder that in the chaos of war, when the plans fall apart and the officers are dead and the radio is silent, sometimes survival comes down to a single soldier who refuses to run. There is a photograph, grainy and poorly composed, taken sometime in early February 1944. It shows a section of the Via Anziate, the road churned to mud by tank treads and shell impacts. In the background, the burned-out hulks of 2 German Panzers, their turrets blown off, their hulls blackened by fire. In the foreground, half buried in the ditch, an empty bazooka rocket tube, discarded after firing. No one remembers who took the photograph, or why. Perhaps some Signal Corps photographer making his rounds, documenting damage for after-action reports. Perhaps a soldier, looking for something to send home, some evidence that he was here, that this happened, that it mattered. The image was not published during the war, no propaganda value in showing how close the line came to breaking. It survives now in archives, one image among millions, uncaptioned and unexplained. But look closely at that empty rocket tube lying in the mud and understand what it represents. Not just a weapon, but a choice. Not just a tool, but an idea made manifest. The idea that ordinary people, given the means and the necessity, can stand against tyranny and win. Not every time, not without cost, but enough, often enough, in enough forgotten ditches along enough nameless roads that the aggregate of their resistance becomes a force that empires cannot overcome. The Germans called it a toy pipe. They learned otherwise at Anzio, and in 10,000 other engagements across 3 continents where American soldiers with bazookas stood their ground and fought. They learned that simplicity is not weakness, that democracy, messy and chaotic and inefficient as it appears, produces a kind of strength that cannot be planned or commanded or engineered. The strength of individuals who believe their choices matter, who act as if they can change outcomes because the society they come from teaches them that they can. Evening falls on the beachhead. The guns have quieted for the moment. The German attack has stalled, pulled back to regroup and resupply. In the medical tents behind the lines, doctors and nurses work under dim lanterns, triaging the wounded, saving who they can. The ranger lies on a stretcher, his hands bandaged, drifting in and out of consciousness. Later there will be questions, debriefings. Medals, perhaps, though the records will be lost and the citations will go to other men or no man at all. But in this moment, he is simply a soldier who has done what soldiers do. Stood when standing was required, fought when fighting was necessary, held the line because the line had to be held. He does not think of himself as a hero. Heroes are for movies and propaganda posters. He thinks about his squad, about the men who did not make it, whose names he will carry for the rest of his life like shrapnel embedded too deep to remove. He thinks about home, about a world where roads do not explode and the sky does not scream, and you can sleep without dreaming of burning tanks. And somewhere in the darkness, along the Via Anziate, 9 German Panzers cool slowly in the winter air, their crews buried nearby in hasty graves or evacuated to field hospitals, their iron hulls testament to the fact that armor alone is not enough, that victory requires more than superior engineering and tactical doctrine, that in the end, war is won by soldiers who refuse to yield, even when yielding seems the only rational choice. The toy pipe broke the iron fist. Not because it was a perfect weapon, but because it was in the hands of a soldier who believed that one man, in the right place at the right time, could matter. And he was right. The beachhead held. Rome fell. The war ground on, month after bloody month, until finally the factories and the willpower and the accumulated sacrifice of millions of ordinary soldiers doing extraordinary things in forgotten places brought the dictatorships to their knees. The end was not clean or simple or cheap, but it came. And when it came, among the countless reasons and factors and forces that made victory possible, one must count this. A single ranger in a ditch at Anzio with a bazooka and a choice, who decided that 9 German tanks would go no further, who decided that this road, this day, this moment, this was where the line held. And it did.